I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I also want to acknowledge the two representatives of Children in Care behind me. I understand I have quite an act to follow. C'est un honneur de comparaître devant le comité.
It's an honor to be here as Minister for Services to Aboriginal Peoples. I would like to be able to respond to your questions regarding Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. I would like to thank the committee for taking the time to do a preliminary study of this bill, because your attention to this matter will no doubt strengthen this bill. A special thank you also to Senator Leboucan Benson for agreeing to sponsor the bill.
Jean-François Tremblay, my Assistant Deputy Minister Joanne Wilkinson, First Nations Child and Services Reform, as well as Issa Gros-Louis. Let me begin by saying that protecting and promoting the well-being of Indigenous children and families should be the foremost priority of the federal government and governments across Canada. However, that has not always been the case. Members of this committee, I know, are aware of the pain and hurt that has been and continues to be inflicted on Indigenous children right across this country. The separation of Indigenous children from their families is not something that just happened in the past. Indigenous families continue to be broken apart today. In fact, it is a worsening problem. More Indigenous children are in care now than at the height of the operation of residential schools. In terms of hard numbers, more than 52% of children in foster care in Canada are Indigenous. 52%. Yet, they represent less than 8% of the population. And studies show that the average Indigenous child in foster care may live with anywhere between 3 to 13 families before turning 19 years old. This is unacceptable. I think that we can all agree that the current system does not work for Indigenous children and families, and that we cannot perpetuate the status quo. As parliamentarians, we must act. Over 20 years ago, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples stated, "The healthy functioning of Aboriginal families has been disrupted largely by misguided government policies. Today's governments have an obligation to make amends. We must act immediately, and with this proposed legislation, we would have a path forward to implement lasting reform. Dans le cadre de l'approche actuelle, on sépare des
Currently, we're separating Indigenous children from their families and their communities. And this creates intergenerational trauma and culturally biased child welfare. This proposed bill seeks to reform this approach and promotes a shift from apprehension to a system built around preventative care.
That would be applicable nationally to guide how services should be provided to Indigenous children and families. Over the past year, we've heard from Indigenous people all over the country about what should be in this bill and what principles should guide it. The principles in this bill: best interests of the child, substantive equality, and cultural continuity, are aligned with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The bill would then provide a clear affirmation of the inherent right of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to exercise their jurisdiction in relation to child and family services. Indigenous families are currently bound by rules and systems that are often not reflective of their cultures and their identities. Our vision is of a system where Indigenous peoples are in charge of their own child and family services, something we recognize should have been the case all along. An important aspect of Bill C-92 is its flexibility. It would not be a one-size-fits-all approach. The bill is designed for Indigenous peoples to exercise partial or full jurisdiction over child and family services at their own pace. Depending on the path chosen, the exercise of their jurisdiction could result in their laws prevailing over federal laws and laws of provinces and territories, if that is the community's choice. Under C-92, when an Indigenous group or community wishes to exercise their jurisdiction over child and family services and have their law prevail over federal, provincial, and territorial laws, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada and the government of each province or territory in which they are located will enter into three-way discussions around a coordination agreement. If an agreement is reached within 12 months following that request, the laws of the Indigenous group or community would have force of law as federal law and prevail over federal, provincial, and territorial child and family service laws. If no agreement is reached within 12 months, but reasonable efforts are made to do so, the Indigenous law will also have force of law as federal law. In practical terms, this means that should a government not act in good faith during the negotiation of a coordination agreement after 12 months of negotiations, Indigenous child and family services law would have precedence over provincial law. But I would hope that provinces would come to the table in good faith, because this is about children and families. To promote a smooth transition and implementation of Bill C-92, Canada will explore the creation of distinctions-based transition governance structures. The co-developed governance structures would identify tools and processes to increase the capacity of communities as they assume responsibility over child and family services. During this phase, we would continue our work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners, as well as with the provinces and territories, to set out the details about how to support communities to exercise jurisdiction. Nous ne pouvons pas imposer de solution.
We cannot have a top-down solution. This is contrary to what Indigenous peoples want. It is contrary to the spirit of reconciliation and goes against the principle of co-development that has guided this proposed legislation.
Culmination of intensive engagement then included nearly 2,000 participants across 65 sessions, including elders, youth, women, grandmothers, aunties, those with lived experience, national, regional, and community organizations representing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, treaty nations, self-governing First Nations, provinces and territories, and other experts. What we heard included values and cultural practices, lived experience, and academic research, as well as recommendations of a reference group that was comprised of representatives from national Indigenous organizations. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have asked time and again for co-developed legislation, from resolutions passed by the Assembly of First Nations in May and December of 2018, to hearing that Inuit leadership wanted a distinctions-based approach, and that the Métis wanted jurisdiction over child and family services to be recognized through legislation. Since the emergency meeting convened by my predecessor in January of 2018, there have been extensive meetings and consultations across the country in an effort to get this right. Even in the weeks preceding the introduction of this bill, we were incorporating the suggestions of Indigenous groups, provincial, and territorial partners. For me, the truest measure of our efforts came from a statement by one of your honorable colleagues, Senator Murray Sinclair, that our approach, quote, should serve as a model for implementing the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action in a meaningful and direct way. That doesn't mean that we stop there. There are no closed doors to our Indigenous partners or to the provinces and the territories. This bill and the children that it aims to protect are only served if we collaborate and ensure their best interests. Also, I am not suggesting that we have achieved perfection in this legislation. I'm the first to admit that there is still room for improvement, and I welcome this committee's input. We also know that funding needs to be part of the equation for this act to have maximum impact. We cannot presume that the funding models that have supported the current and broken system will be what Indigenous groups want to use while exercising their jurisdiction. Those models and levels should be discussed and designed through the coordination agreement process, and we pledge to work with partners to identify long-term needs and funding gaps. If passed, Bill C-92 would help to ensure that both the guiding principles and the legislative framework would be in place, protecting the needs of Indigenous children and families for generations to come. I am determined to continue the tremendous momentum that they created, and I am determined to move this bill forward. This is the time to follow through on our promises to Indigenous children, families, and communities. Madam Chair, I would be pleased to take any questions that the committee members may have. Miigwech, Nakamik, Marcy, merci, thank you.